And I'm here to talk a little bit about the development of our asphalt product category rule. And Online's done it a little bit, but give you a little bit more information on how recycling is actually incorporated into our Emerald Eco Label, which is our EPD program. For those of you who are not familiar with what NAPA is, we are the association that represents the asphalt plant contractors for the United States. We do have a few international members, but we represent them before Congress, before regulatory agencies. We develop programs that help and highlight the industry, but we're also very involved in terms of technology transfer and ensuring that best practices are disseminated to the contractors in the U.S. And we help find ways for them to follow those. And recently, over about the last 5 or 6 years, we have taken on the topic of sustainability as something that's a core principle to what NAPA focuses on. And as a part of that, our EPD program and PCR program were developed to ensure that the industry has a better understanding of what its environmental impacts truly are. And so while we haven't really seen this fully played out, there are 3 different terms that we need to make sure we understand. The first is the product category rule, which is kind of the framework. This is a slide that's been seen many times, as adapted from something that Santero did when he was in graduate school. But the product category rule is a set of specific rules, requirements, and guidelines for developing Type 3 environmental product declarations for one or more products. The life cycle assessment, as was described earlier, is the process. It's really the accounting system, and the environmental product declaration itself is the declaration of what are the environmental impacts associated with a product or process. And the way I kind of describe it to some people is the product category, if you're comparing it to football, the product category rule is that rule book that tells you here's what you have to follow, here's how you're going to play the game. The life cycle assessment is the process. It's the coach deciding what plays they're going to run, and it can either have a positive or a negative impact. And the environmental product declaration is that final box score at the end, which tells you not only the final score, but how that score was achieved, so that there's a better understanding of what took place. Now, I was asked to talk a little bit about the development of our PCR, and if you think about what it takes to create a PCR, there are really 6 steps that come along in that process. The first one is you have to select a program operator, figure out who's going to run the program. Second, find or commission an LCA study on your product type. You develop a PCR committee, which is in charge of helping set up the organization and the rules. You make all the relevant decisions in the committee. You have a draft PCR reviewed by at least 3 experts and have an open comment period. And then you can finally publish your PCR at the end. So I want to tell you a little bit about the process NAPA took in each of these steps and how we came about with the program that we have developed today. So the first thing that we wanted to do is select a program operator, and there were other program operators that were out there. ASTM is a program operator, but what NAPA wanted to do is really become the program operator itself. We felt, one, there's probably not a lot of people in the world that understand the process of creating an asphalt mixture on a daily basis more than the people who actually create those mixtures. And so understanding of the process and the ins and outs, we felt was important for us. Additionally, there was concerns about data sensitivity. A lot of contractors are putting proprietary mix designs, fuel usages, things like that into a program, and they wanted to be confident that their data were going to be able to be confidential and safe. And so that the comfort they had with NAPA in this process, I think, aided them in feeling more secure in the program itself. The second thing was to find or commission an LCA study, and Amlan discussed this earlier and kind of what the process was, and it was basically creating kind of an industry-wide LCA. And what he found from going to around 40 different plants and getting data from around 50, this basically became the basis for our eco label. It allowed us to have the information and the data that we would need to make some of the calculations that were part of the process later on. The third step was develop a PCR committee. And what you see on the screen right now is the list of people who are actually official members of the committee. Joe Mahoney was kind of the PCR committee chair. but we had people ranging from contractors such as Ron Sines with CRH Americas, John Callahan with Palmer Paving. We had DOT with Daryl Krass in Michigan, Gina Alstrom from FHWA. We had a city. We even had some of the binder industry represented with Christopher Peach and Mark Buncher in the Asphalt Institute. And so what we really wanted to do is have a wide variety of stakeholders brought together to understand what was going on and help make these decisions. Heather Dilla, when she was with NAPA, helped organize this group and provide some guidance, as well as online work she did as well. And I helped some while I was down at NCAT finishing this process. But again, we felt it was good to have a diversity, not just paving people, but people that might be asking for these one day, such as FHWA or Michigan DOT, involved in this process. So that was more transparent. All stakeholders were brought to the table, and it would be a transparent document by the end. The fourth step was making all relevant decisions in the committee. And this had to do with things like, where were we going to draw the system boundaries? What allocation methods were we going to do and use involving things like the asphalt binder? It was discussed earlier that there were different options that were available, and ours is kind of a combination of a mass and economic yield that was really developed and thought out by Rebecca Yang when she was at the University of Illinois for graduate school. Additionally, what processes were we going to include in this? As was previously mentioned, there's a lot of kind of missing data that we're trying to get those gaps filled at this time, but what would we include and what wouldn't? And one of the other challenges we had to figure out was, well, what standards were we going to follow? Originally, we were going to stay compliant to ISO 14025 and 14040. And eventually we figured out then we had to take another step and do some more. But that was the original basis, was try to be compliant with those two standards and make sure that our decisions fell in line with those. One of the decisions we did have to make was, where were we going to draw the system boundaries, and we decided to go with a cradle to gate option. There were some other PCRs which went to not necessarily full construction stage, but they went from materials acquisition to driving the materials to the construction site. But that's something we're actually looking into pretty heavily right now, is what it would take to move our PCR to include that, and even possibly the construction phase. But really, we're just in the process of doing a feasibility study right now. So if you look at the results from our EPD program, we start with the material acquisition, whether that's the aggregate, the binder, some of the other different materials, transportation of those to the plant production facility, and then the production of the material itself is included. One of the reasons this seemed also kind of a natural fit for what we are is because we are the people that are producing the asphalt mixtures, and those are the things that we really have direct control of. I don't necessarily have control of the maintenance and rehabilitation schedule that the state DOT is going to implement on things, but I can control the material selection, how I get it to the facility, and how I treat it when it's at the facility. The fifth step was have your draft PCR reviewed by at least 3 experts. We did have our open comment period during the summer of 2016. And we had numerous comments that were brought forth and addressed as a part of that process to try to make it more in line with current philosophies relating to LCA. And then we had our expert review, which took us a little bit longer than we thought would originally happen. But Ute Meyer from the Right Environment, Christoph Koffler from ThinkStep, and John Harvey from the UC Davis or California Pavement Research Center were our 3 experts. And so their job was basically to ensure that we fell in line with the ISO standards, that we ensured that we were following the best practices which were currently available for the boundary conditions that we had. And eventually, after a few months of working with them and going back and forth, we were able to come to a consensus on something that they would agree with, and said it met the current best practices. So the final thing, technically, is to publish your final PCR, and we did that in 2017, but in reality, our work wasn't done at that time, because in October of 2016, LEED came out with their guidance that said if you have a EPD that wants to be given full lead credit for, it needs to follow either a certain ISO standard or EN 15804, which is a European standard. So we had to go back and make sure that our new EPDs, when they were produced, were going to fall in line with that European standard. One of the reasons we chose this was because we knew the ISO standard was being redone at the time. And so we wanted to do something that we knew we would meet and we would continue to meet for a while. So that's why when you look at our EPDs, we use both the Tracy reporting system, but we also use CML because that was the requirements out of EN 15804. And so another question or another thing that we had to think through is how do we make EPDs accessible? How do we make it where it's not going to be a lot of work, it's not going to be a lot of time for our contractors to be able to use this, because we want it to be something that's accessible to industry. And so that's really where the Emerald Ecolabel comes from. It's a web-based tool that our contractors can use. They can sign up for. It's hosted by a third party to ensure confidentiality of mix design. And a contractor can go in, they can set up an organization, a plant, and then they can go through and develop EPDs based upon the plant. And at the end, they click on a button that says create an EPD, and they have it brought forth to them. Another thing that we did to try to make this even easier for our contractors was develop a web-based tool, or to develop a data gathering spreadsheet, because it is a pretty data-intensive process. And so we wanted to make sure that they were able to get the data that they needed fairly easily. And so this guides them and tells them exactly what they need to get before they start putting their data into the program. And at the end, this is kind of an example of what one of our EPDs might look like. They can customize it with things like a company logo, but it will then report all the requirements from both the ISO and the EN standards. The other thing to remember, and one of the questions we get frequently, is can our EPDs be compared to those of the concrete mixtures? And in reality, they still can't, because the two PCRs aren't harmonized completely at this point. And so we need to make sure that we're comparing things under the same PCR we need to make sure we're comparing products under the same PCR to each other. So we get to the end and we start thinking about how do we handle recycling. And Amlan covered this a little bit, but this is really falls under section 14 of our PCR under allocation. We look at things like recycled and reclaimed materials such as RAP, RAS, GTR, and RFO. They're treated as a waste material without economic value. And so there are two things that we have to think about: the upstream impacts and the processes for recycling materials in preparation for their use in asphalt materials. If we think about the upstream impact, the previous life cycle impacts are not included. For example, what it would take to produce a tire that was eventually went into ground tire rubber or recycled tire rubber would not be incorporated into that process. However, we think about the processes for preparation of that use in asphalt mixtures. These processes are within the system boundaries. So for example, taking a tire, grinding it up to form recycled tire rubber, that's within the system boundaries. Processing RAP and RAS at your plant or at a facility to be used in an asphalt mixture, those things are within the system boundaries. And so we do account for those energies and those outputs which come from the process of creating those four asphalt mixtures. Some other things that we have to consideration, we do, as Amlan showed, we do consider the transportation of the materials back to the plant. We have that assumption of 50 miles. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more. But it's very difficult for a specific mix to be able to know exactly how far that RAP travels. One of the things that we did consider is, do you think about milling the RAP and the energy that takes? And in our PCR, we don't account for milling RAP. Part of that's because that's more in the maintenance or rehabilitation phase, or maybe even end of life, and that then falls outside of the system boundaries that we have. So if you want more information about this, we have information on general information at asphaltpavement.org/EPD. If you want to see more about the tool itself, And what it does, that's at asphaltepd.org. And then there are many people that are interested in how EPDs can be used in terms of things like green rating tools. And we do have some information regarding that in terms of webinars and information at our store at store.asphaltpavement.org. With that, I thank you for the few minutes I had to talk a little bit about how NAPA developed its PCR and how it looked at recycling inside of it. If you have any technical questions, I've got my contact information, or if you have any questions more on how the program is run itself, you can contact Kelly Canaris, who's our Associate Director of Member Programs. With that, I am finished.
Richard, thank you very much, and I appreciate. I know you had to hurry up, and I appreciate you trying to bring us a little bit back on time. We've had a couple of questions that have been asked for you, and again, as with other speakers, since we'll have just time for 1 or 2 questions. If there are additional questions, then I'll email them to you. But one of the first questions that I have is, are asphalt producers using the PCR to generate EPDs for different products, example, with or without RAP?
So currently we've got a few member companies that are starting to explore the tool, and I say right now that most people are piloting it or just exploring what options the tool gives them. And I don't know if they're doing a lot of necessarily comparison between products at the moment. This is something that's relatively new for our contractors, and right now they're just trying to understand it a little bit more before people start actively asking them to produce EPDs. So I don't know if there are many comparisons that are actually being done at this time using our PCR.
Thank you for that answer. I had one more question, Richard. It's more of looking into future. Do you see this, or do you see this EPD really getting to the, as we build more science behind it, as you mentioned, and as we continue to refine things, as a association, do you think long term will it get to the point where you have a EPD that even goes to maybe not to every truck, but every time you are, or every day of production, and it's reading things off the plant in real time, reading the flow meters and your cold feeds and so on? Do you think that is something that would be long-term vision, or do you think the association is content with where we are right now in terms of doing it per mix design?
I tell you what, I haven't thought long-term in terms of daily EPD based upon actual energy usage and flows at this point. As was mentioned earlier, there's still many data gaps that we're trying to gather. And so our emphasis right now is, 1, getting people to try the program, 2, trying to get data to fill in many of those holes. We're talking to some of our associate members about looking at producing LCAs for some of their additives, because that is a glaring kind of hole in the data that we have right now. So I think the goal is to, 1, try to get more widespread adoption of contractors using it and experimenting with it, 2, fill in the data gaps that we've got, and 3, like I said, expand the system boundaries as we can. And that's one of the reasons why we're exploring things like the construction phase at the moment. If we were to start looking at individual data on a day-to-day basis, that could get really overwhelming in terms of the amount of data that you're having to then put into the system every single day to get exact values.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard, for that answer. I think that really addresses the question in terms of obviously what this is right now doing, and then how, as we move forward, what is the area or direction that we'd like to build into. So next we'll go ahead with our next presenter, and that's Heather Dilla from Federal Highway Administration. Heather, you should see on your screen. Yep, I see you sharing it already. So go ahead whenever you're ready.